Well, thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for being here. What we're going to be talking about is the biology of burnout and why an inside-out approach is really going to help you build your well-being. And we'll have three strategies that you can utilize today. But before I dive in, I really want to acknowledge that it's easy to come to a session like this and think to yourself, it's just going to be an AFGO. Now, of course, you know what an AFGO is, don't you? Well, it's another blank growth opportunity. Here, we're coming here. She's going to tell us do yoga, meditate, keep a gratitude journal, and everything will be wonderful. So I want to acknowledge that cynicism that we can bring to these sessions, very real, but that's not what we're doing today. So let me dive into instead what we are doing. And I want to briefly just really get clear about some of the challenges that we're facing in healthcare, Humana and beyond. We're going to talk about what the components are of burnout and the levels of burnout. Really importantly, we're going to talk about the biology of burnout, which may seem a little esoteric, but you're going to see why it is critically important for you to understand your own biology. And so it'll help you to restore a sense of autonomy that is a key ingredient in mitigating burnout. Very importantly, we'll go over three strategies, and then at the end, we'll touch on resources that you'll have ongoing access to. If you haven't already downloaded the worksheet, I hope that maybe Sarah can pop that into the chat or put something in the chat about how people can access that if they haven't. Now, let's be honest, there's a popular narrative out there that, and not certainly just at Humana, I'm going to speak globally, that the system is broken, dysfunctional, in bad shape, and that burnout of us working in healthcare, whether we're on the utilization management side or the clinical side or wherever we are, almost a sense that burnout is inevitable. And I'm here to help you understand the truth that you do not have to hand over your happiness to a dysfunctional, broken, ailing healthcare system. That's if you take nothing away today, I want you to understand that you do not have to hand over your happiness to a broken system. And for physicians, APPs, and really everyone in healthcare, you can surmount burnout. And it starts with understanding your own biology and utilizing well-being strategies that increase your sense of autonomy. So we're going to be looking at this kind of a comical slide, but untangling some of the things that can get in the way of our doing so. So let's face it, it's a challenging time in healthcare. Some of you may have heard the term VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and chaos, and ambiguity. And this is really the beat in healthcare in the United States in 2025. The volatility, all the mergers and acquisitions, all the changes that are occurring, the changes that are occurring more broadly in society that are bearing down on us in healthcare. The uncertainty, certainly we know about uncertainty given the COVID pandemic. We didn't see that coming. And look at how much uncertainty it raised for each of you in your practices, for your families, obviously for the society as a whole. And we don't really know what's going to happen next. The complexity, the chaos that we can find ourselves in, the complexity for those of you on the insurance side, the complexity of, whether you're authorizing or denying a test that a colleague out in the field thinks is important, the complexity on the clinical side. And very importantly, the ambiguity that leaves each of you with. What does all of this mean for me? What does it mean for my family? What does it mean for my future? So these are challenging times, and that's really reflected in the high levels of burnout that we see. This is the most recent report that we have from Medscape 2024 data, and we can see really extraordinarily high levels of burnout. I mean, a low of plastic surgery and ophthalmology and psychiatry in 1 in 3 physicians, which really isn't that low, and a high up here in emergency medicine, OBGYN, oncology, peds, family practice, frontline IM of 2 in 3 physicians. And we don't have as much data about burnout in APPs, but I think we're beginning to understand that those rates are also in the worrisome category. Let's just back up and look at as we embark on this series of programs. What is burnout? How do you know when you're in burnout? And there's really a clinical triad that I think is critically important to understand. The first aspect of that clinical triad is emotional exhaustion. The well is dry. We're in a state of fatigue and exhaustion. Even if we're lucky enough to get a good night's sleep, we're kind of dragging ourselves around from one thing to the next, feeling very depleted. The second aspect is a sense of cynicism. Why bother? Why did I go into the practice of medicine or advanced practice nursing in the first place? And with that is a very uncomfortable sense of depersonalization. We begin to view our patients, our coworkers, maybe even our family members as obstacles that we have to navigate through in the course of our day rather than the full human beings that they are. And very challenging, we lose our sense of meaning, purpose, and accomplishment. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But that's the clinical triad that helps define when we're in burnout. There's also a fourth feature that I see in the many physicians that I've had the pleasure of coaching, and that's that we almost develop a kind of tunnel vision. And in that tunnel vision, we're only focused on what is not going well within ourselves, within our healthcare systems, and more broadly. And it's very hard for us to look beyond those blinders and actually see what is truly going well. So you'll see I want to introduce a little bit of levity in an otherwise difficult topic. So here's the physician talking to the patient, depressed, anxious, feeling undervalued. Well, okay, enough, bad enough about me. What can I do for you? And this takes me to a term that many of you may be familiar with, moral injury. It's a term that comes to us from the military, where we send young individuals, largely young men, off to do heinous acts in the name of democracy, in the name of protecting country and citizenry. And that term is increasingly applied to us, the actors in the healthcare endeavor, when we're pulled in so many directions and we can't necessarily provide optimal care or optimal strategies on the business side because we have so many kind of so many pipers that we have to dance to. So I want to acknowledge that because it's very real and it can leave us feeling like this, that this is the final measure of our worth, a tombstone. Here lies Dr. Jones' lifetime RVU below the median. And as Alex alluded to, there are many factors that contribute to clinician burnout. A lot of work has been done on this at Stanford and by an individual, Tate Shanafelt.
Cool, because I can't get.
And that helps us understand that there are really three domains of burnout. And I'm using the term clinician broadly for physicians, for APPs, but even if you're not engaged in clinical medicine right now, this definitely applies. So we see here the culture of wellness, the efficiency of practice, the systems that are or aren't in place to promote efficiency of practice. And then we see what Stanford has called personal resilience. Now, I want to be clear. Each and every one of you has tremendous resilience. And we have many studies demonstrating high levels of resilience in physicians, and I'm sure that's true for APPs as well. So I don't really want to use the term resilience here, but I want to use the term personal well-being and strategies that you can use. So we could spend hours on the systems issues, but that's not our focus today and largely in this program. We're really focusing on you and what can you do to stay out of burnout. So now that we've covered some of this very brief overview of healthcare in 2025, the question that I want to ask you is, do you believe that your training gave you what you need to manage what can only be called the stormy seas of this time? So Laura, if you can launch that poll. Wonderful. So if those of you on the call can answer, yes, my training gave me what I need, or no, my training did not. So please take a moment to answer that poll. And Laura, I can't see the response rate, so I'll leave it to you when we have sort of a decent response rate to share the results.
I can see it. It might be because I'm recording it. I think we're good. We've actually have 75% of you responded. So
Wonderful.
I
And
will share them. Let me know if you see them.
okay, so very interesting. 21% of you said, yes, my training gave me what I need to manage this time. But interestingly, 79%, so basically 4 out of 5 of you said, no, my training did not give me what I need to manage the stormy seas of this time. And, I give similar talks to this across our land. And I'll be honest with you, this is pretty typical 80-20, sometimes it's even 90-10. So let's look at, well, what did you learn in your training alongside with, all the zebra diseases that you'll probably never see in your specialty, and so many other wonderful things. Did you learn to strive for perfection? And possibly even get this idea that if you weren't perfect, you might actually be deemed a failure. Did you learn to defer self-care? And I encourage you as I'm going through these to put something in the chat, if you don't mind, about whether you learned some of these things or not. Did you learn to deny your own needs? Never call in sick. Perhaps feel shame when you don't have an answer, even in the early period of the COVID pandemic when none of us had an answer. I heard this from a lot of individuals. Did you learn to hide your struggles? Never ask for help. Care for everyone else before caring for yourself. And perhaps you learned to be highly self-critical. And what do I mean by that? Well, we can find ourselves saying things to ourselves that we wouldn't say to somebody else. You're a failure, you don't do anything right, you're not as smart or good or as good a diagnostician as others, you're not as articulate, and perhaps even you don't really deserve to be happy. So I'm just scrolling through the chat to see what people have put in here. And while I'm talking, feel free to put more things in the chat. There's often a second communication that's going on here, but I see never call out sick. I remember rounding in the ICU with my own IV. Definitely. All of the above. Yes to all those listed. I trained when women were looked at as weak, so we had to stay strong. All of the above, all of the above.
Wrong.
So in the cartoon, the surgery, you can see the surgeon talking to the patient. Congratulations, we've successfully removed your inner critic. I wish it were so easy, frankly. And if you didn't learn any of the above, many of you learned this, that you needed to be Wonder Woman or Superman. Again, the one who solves the problem, the one who has all the answers, the one who can kind of fly in at the last moment and make everything right. Now, I just want to say that in the midst of all the good that we learned, these are some challenging things that we carry with us. And again, I've coached almost 1,000 physicians, my team, many more than that. And we see over and over the impact of what we learned in our training. Again, so much of it is good, but there are also things that begin to derail us as we move forward in our career. So in addition to some of this background, I want to shift now into really a deeper dive into the biology of burnout, because there are some things that you may not be aware of that can not only expand your awareness, but can begin to give you tools to manage your own biology in the spirit of mitigating and avoiding burnout. Let me start with the first of these studies, Physician Distress and Burnout, the Neurobiologic Perspective. This was published in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings a few years ago, March 2021. And one of the authors, Dr. Tate Shanafelt, as I mentioned, is the Chief Wellness Officer at Stanford. He's really a leading voice in our understanding of clinician burnout. And what's really key to understand, and what Dr. Shanafelt goes into in that article, is that there are two key areas of the brain that are deeply important when we think about the biologic processes that underlie burnout and also underlie well-being. So those two areas are the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. And just as a quick review, the prefrontal cortex is that area in the frontal lobe of the brain where executive function resides. That really is where we can think, where we can reason, where we can have insight. And as you can see on the left-hand column, that's also the area for empathy. It's the area for flexibility, agility, and how we respond to difficult circumstances. It's the place where morality guides us, attuned communication, and modulation of fear. Now, many of you know that we also have a limbic system, right? The amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the basal ganglia. And this serves a very different function, the limbic system that developed on an evolutionary basis very early on, as opposed to the prefrontal cortex, which developed much later in our evolution. But they'll serve, really, the service and objective of the limbic system is to keep us safe. So in caveman and cavewomen times, what was the limbic system doing? Well, the amygdala was scouting for threats in the environment because we didn't exactly survive and move up the evolutionary ladder because of our physical prowess. So we needed a system to alert us to danger and threat. Fast forward to the modern era, most of us are not in that kind of physical danger that we would have been, on an evolutionary basis. So what is the limbic system doing now? Well, it's looking out for emotional threats, threats to our integrity, to our ego. Somebody cutting us off in traffic, a nasty text from our teenager, whatever it is, these things that leave us feeling almost a sense of psychological assault or lack of safety. Now, while these two parts of the brain coexist for all of us, in a sense, they're a little bit of opposites, right? The prefrontal cortex can reason, can take time. It's a little bit slower than the limbic system, which I think each of you can relate to. The limbic system is like this. We've all had that experience of going from 0 to 90. Again, you get cut off in traffic, you make a physical hand gesture, you start screaming in your car before you even know it. That's the limbic system in action. So they're kind of operating as two different factors, the balance of which contributes to a sense of well-being. And what you can see in this graph is that while we want strong prefrontal cortex action, the strength of the prefrontal cortex varies based on conditions. So when we're asleep, fine. We're deep asleep, our prefrontal cortex gets to take a rest. But when we're sleep deprived, our prefrontal cortex, that area that helps us reason, use caution, be very professional in our discussion, really loses function. And similarly, when we're experiencing a lot of stress, particularly perceived as uncontrollable stress, that's when we also lose PFC function. And if we think about the balance between PFC and the limbic system, as the PFC function lessens, unfortunately, limbic control increases. And we can think about calm, eustress, and distress. And obviously, a certain amount of stress contributes to optimal performance. But there's a breaking point after a certain level. when too much stress, particularly uncontrollable stress, tips us over into distress and into burnout. And this may seem like too much of a biology class, but what I really want you to understand is the impact that this has for each and every one of us. And what you can see here is strong prefrontal cortex working in a top-down fashion, as opposed to a weaker state. And this comes to us from that Shanafelt article that for us as clinicians, and I think this is equally true for those on the business side at Humana, that when our PFC function is eroded, we become forgetful. We don't excel as well in flexibility of thought. We kind of concretize in a way, which unfortunately increases our potential for errors, medical and otherwise. We have difficulty concentrating. We become more disorganized, which of course makes it harder to manage the complex tasks that each of you have as part of your work. It impairs our decision making. It erodes our judgment, our moral conscience, which sets us up for decreased levels of professionalism, saying things that we later regret or acting in ways that we know we shouldn't. Decreased empathy, decreased optimism and persistence, which can contribute, as you see here, to cynicism and a decreased sense of engagement. And very importantly, we erode our ability to self-regulate, which increases the likelihood of unprofessional behaviors. And I really want to be clear, unprofessional behaviors at work, but behaviors like irritability and not showing up the way we want to with our family members. So what I really want you to understand here is that inside your brain, this is going on. This is very relevant to your day-to-day, and we're going to get to very briefly, in a very brief period, how you can exert more control over your biology so it really works in your favor rather than eroding some of the functions that you need to function well. Okay, so here's a very old-looking doctor and a younger picture on the wall. Being a doctor really ages you. That was me 3 years ago and 4,217 prior auths ago. So again, just want to bring a little bit of lightness into this discussion. Let me move now that we've talked a little bit about these two key areas of the brain. I want to move to the second study that I mentioned, which came out around the same time, 2020. That really points to what's going on neurochemically when we're stressed, when we're in or moving towards burnout. And of course, all of you are familiar with all of the neurochemicals on the slide, but let's just do a quick review. The catecholamines, norepi and epinephrine, which of course are part and parcel of the sympathetic nervous system and are released very quickly in response to a stressor. Cortisol, released through the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is a longer lasting stress hormone, helps us to mobilize energy reserves on a longer term basis, but I think, as we all know, has negative effects on many parts of the body and negative effects in terms of maintaining a state of chronic stress. On the other side of the equation, we have dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, hormones and neurotransmitters that can really counter some of the effects, but unfortunately are depleted when we're in a chronic stress situation. When we're in burnout, they're depleted. So they don't have the ability to counteract the revving up, the sympathetic overdrive we can experience when we're in burnout. Now, I want to move this from, again, some kind of biology lecture into something very practical. So I'm just going to walk you through 3 brief vignettes. The first, you're driving a car on your way to work, and the traffic is abysmal. And guess what? Somebody cuts you off thinking that they can get into, ahead of you and be faster than you. Imagine for a minute what's going on in your biology. Which hormones, which neurotransmitters are coming to the fore? And if you'd be kind enough to put that in the chat, just What do you think is going on in your biology in that situation? Okay, we've got one for cortisol, adrenaline, catecholamines, in caps, all the cortisol. Okay, I think that one is pretty straightforward. We know what that feels like. We can almost feel the cortisol kind of coursing through our vasculature. Let's go to a second scenario. If you're on the clinical side, you know you have to get your charts done at the end of the day, and unfortunately, you're a little bit behind, so you're feeling some dread about getting the charts done. If you're on the UM side of the organization, you've got a couple of peer-to-peers coming up today that you're kind of concerned how they're going to go. You've had some interactions with the clinician on the other side of the phone or Zoom, and you're feeling some dread. So take a crack at that. What of these neurochemicals are going up and which ones are going down in this second vignette? Okay, so it says still the cortisol. I think that's true. Low dopamine, low serotonin, more cortisol, no serotonin. Yeah, we are always behind. Yeah. Okay, dopamine is going down. Yeah. And let's try a third vignette. We'll go back in time. Let's say it's the December holidays. You've just gotten the perfect gift from somebody who you know really cares about you. And it was a thoughtful gift, and it just brought you so much joy and such a sense of connection and fulfillment to that individual. What's going on there with your neurochemicals? Okay, high dopamine, high serotonin, increased dopamine. Lots of dopamine, increased serotonin. So what I really want you to be aware of here is this ability to actually know what's going on inside of you, because the more we are aware of what's going on inside of us neurochemically, we stand a better chance of being able to modulate it. So in example number 2, something that I think each of you in your various capacities at Humana can relate to, you could do this as part of your preparation. You could almost be talking yourself through it. Boy, I'm feeling some dread here, and I can almost tell that my cortisol is rising. And you know what? I don't really want my cortisol to rise because I know about all the negative effects that chronic overstimulation of cortisol can have on my immune system, on my heart, on every aspect of my CNS. So what can I do right now to modulate that, to bring that down? It really gets to what's under your control and what isn't, because what we're increasingly understanding about burnout is the difference between uncontrolled and controlled stressors. Uncontrolled stressors, let me actually go to that here. I'll come back to this. Uncontrolled stressors, we might say on the left side of this slide, is that most of us are employed at this point in time. Well over 75% of physicians, I'm imagining the number is even higher for APPs, are actually employed in our jobs. And we face inefficient work processes, even in the best workplace. We have to document visits. We have productivity metrics. And as employees, almost by definition, we have less control over the conditions of our work than when we're in our own practice environment. So there are plenty of things that are beyond our control. But in addition to what I said about beginning to control your own biology by tuning into it and asking yourself, what can I do to mitigate? There are some other areas where you can have greater control. One is reversing that deficit focus that 80% of you identified that was part of your training. We can also have greater control by not running on empty, by helping our prefrontal cortex, by getting adequate sleep, by taking care of ourselves nutritionally, by exercising. We can also shift from the self-criticism that most of us learned in our training. If we didn't learn it before or afterwards, we can shift that to a different inner milieu of kindness to ourselves and compassion. Because when things are difficult, human beings deserve compassion, just as we bring to our patients. And we can also develop autonomy over our own mind, otherwise known as mindfulness. But let me just back up here, excuse me. When we focus on things that we cannot control, we can lapse into something called learned helplessness. And you may remember this from studies on rats and dogs that you learned about in college, where the rats, for example, are put in a cage and a noxious stimulus is developed in cage one. They can click on something with a paw that releases them from the noxious stimula. In cage number two, they can push on that, but nothing happens. That's part one of the experiment. Then if we go to part two of the experiment, all of the rats, even the ones who didn't get any response, were not able to leave the noxious stimuli, they don't even try anymore to press that lever because they've learned that nothing they do matters. And, you know, just to drive it home, learned helplessness, a horse out in the sun tied to a rickety picnic chair, not going anywhere. Or we can even be like this, feeling like we can bang our head against a wall. And it's very easy to think, well, how could I not have learned helplessness? You know, they somewhere out there need to fix everything that isn't going well. And that's a very logical state to come to. But again, what we're talking about today and in this entire series is what can you do to improve your lot, to reduce the chances that you're going to get burnout? And if you're in burnout, what are the tools you need to mitigate it? Because well beyond Humana, you know, how soon is the healthcare system going to kind of fix itself? Next week? Next month? Next year? I think we all know that the challenges are really deep. And again, I hear about this from physicians that I coach in all institutions across our fair land. A lot of challenges in healthcare. And what do we do? How do we focus on the ones that we can have control over? So we looked at the challenges in healthcare in general. We pivoted. We looked at biology and your own biology. Let's go to the worksheet now. If you could pull that up. This is my dog, Miss Sydney. For those of you who are pet lovers, I want to introduce her to you. You can't see it here, but she is very tuned in to her sense of accomplishment. When she caught that stick, that tail was just wagging away. But for us, it can be really hard to hang on to our sense of accomplishment, can't it? So I just want to ask a few questions. I'd like you to use the worksheet to put in the answers, and you can also put them in the chat if you would. Are you someone who tends to focus on your strengths or your weaknesses? And, you know, you're just giving a guesstimate here. I'm just scrolling through the chat. Okay, thank you. You guys are great putting things in here. Weaknesses, weaknesses. Oh, there's one. Focuses on their strengths. Someone says both. Someone says part of our helplessness is that other employees may not have the same high standards. Yeah, I think that's a very legitimate concern. I mask all of my neurochemicals with copious quantities of caffeine. Well, luckily, that's a legalized substance. Some of you focus on your strengths. Okay. Do you tend to focus on what you've accomplished or what you haven't? In other words, are you somebody who gets into bed at night and maybe does an inventory of everything you haven't accomplished? Or maybe has a running to-do list and you're focused on what you have to get done the next day? Or perhaps you're good at focusing on what you've accomplished. And the third question is, do you pay more attention to what is going well or what isn't within yourself, at your work, in your family, more globally in society? Where do you tend to pay attention? Someone says, depends on when you ask me. Every rose has a thorn. What I haven't accomplished. Can always feel like you can learn more. I've learned to focus on my strengths and accomplishments. I'm trying to focus on my strengths. I am focusing on what I'm accomplishing. Right, the running to-do list that many of us have. And this is one area where we can begin to control our stress. Now, I'm not here to say to you, oh, you're all wonderful. Just focus on the good that you're doing. That would be psychobabble. But my hope is that through this session and through this whole program, that you'll begin to see that you have more control about where you focus than may be initially apparent to you. Now, often when I ask people to focus on what they're doing well, the mind does everything but that. And you can see here with the brain and the heart, the heart is saying, look, brain, look over here. Look at all these good things. And the brain is with the magnifying glass looking at the one bad thing, not now. Can't you see I'm busy? That's the negativity bias that rules the human mind and brain. But the more we're aware of that negativity bias, the more we're aware of where we're focusing, we can use that to leverage change, to shift to something that really is more resourceful for us and builds our sense of control rather than eroding it. We're going to launch a second poll now because I'm curious, what's your ratio of self-promoting, kind, helpful thoughts to ones that could only be called self-critical or self-defeating? So take a moment and just think about that. Are you somebody who has a lot of self-promoting? You can really look in the mirror and remind yourself, whatever is going south with aging, there's some good features there. Or you can remind yourself, wow, I'm really good at what I do. I'm not perfect, but I have a lot of strengths. Are you more in the one-to-one, kind of a neutral of things, good things that you think about yourself as opposed to criticism? Or are you down here with far more self-critical messages than ones that are self-promoting? So just take a minute. And I'm on the edge of my seat waiting to see what the poll results are.
All right, I'll just give it a couple more seconds. Looks like, oh, as soon as I said that, it started ticking up some more. We're at about 50%.
Looking like a nice bell curve.
Yeah.
Hmm.
All right, I will end the poll now and share the results.
Oh my goodness. Wait, sorry, it popped off my screen.
Oh,
Maybe you have to
it
read. There you
There
go.
we go.
Yeah, that is quite a bell curve. Look at that. So wonderful. I'm glad that at least some of you are, one-to-one. It looks like about 55 or so, maybe more percent of you are at least kind of neutral to positive there. And then, of course, there are the rest of us that have a lot of self-critical voices. And I want to challenge you to think about 3 things you've done well over the past week. And you can write that in and you can put it in the chat as well, because I think that'll be very inspiring for others. Again, because so many times we're focused on what we didn't do well or what we perceive we didn't do well or what remains undone. We're ruminating about, something we said or a report that we put in or a note that we wrote or a peer-to-peer, whatever it is. Wow, look at all these positives. Wonderful. I survived, donated to the LA Fire Relief, wonderful, healthy lifestyle. I cooked dinner when I got home to my family. I was on the treadmill to start the day every morning of the week. Fantastic. Had fun in the snow with my kids. I helped a neighbor. Wonderful. So as you're thinking right now about the 3 things that you did well this week, what do you think's going on with your biology in this moment? What do you think your cortisol levels are? Your dopamine, your serotonin. And so many times we do well in our workplace. We get accolades from patients, from colleagues, from those who supervise us, and yet our focus, What we come home and talk about at the dinner table with our poor spouse and kids is everything that isn't going well. So I think as you're hearing this, you realize maybe I can have a little more agency here, a little more autonomy. In other words, maybe I can right that balance of controllable versus uncontrollable stress. This is not about some Pollyanna, just be grateful for everything and life will be wonderful. These are the realistic positives that each of you have in the course of your day, small and large. Let's go now to well-being strategy number 2. Don't run on empty. So many of the clinicians that I've coached over the years tell me with some pride, I don't eat breakfast. I don't eat breakfast. It's really not that important. And, I'm pretty good with 4 hours of sleep. And unfortunately, not filling our tank with basic sustenance like sleep and nutrition really erodes the function of the prefrontal cortex. And I'm sure it has impacts on cortisol levels as well. So I want you to think about, well, what are some of the positive things that fill up my tank? You can see suggestions here. Psychosocial support, social health, mindfulness activities, positive psychology, strengths-based, emotional intelligence, mentorship, intellectual stimulation. Could be taking a nap, walking the dog, playing or listening to music that you enjoy, a warm cup of tea, cooking, a hobby, resting for 5 minutes. All of these things can help fill up your tank, can help you exert control, even when you feel like you don't have that control. These are realistic strategies that you can take. And I'm looking at the clock. I think I'm going to have to pick up my pace a little bit here, but I want to encourage you to take this worksheet and add some things to it, even after our time together today. Dancing to music in the store, lovely. Hugs, seeing my kids happy, not just seeing my kids happy, but remembering that I'm seeing my kids happy, having that lovely picture on your desk of your kids and actually looking at it to remind yourself in the setting of really filling your tank, taking that control. I'm going to just move along here and go to a third strategy, which is, again, extracting that inner critic that we saw in that surgery comic and really being kinder to yourself because your lives are hard. Your work lives are demanding, whatever your capacity is in Humana. It's hard work. There's no question about that. If we pile on to that hard work more criticism of ourselves, we're not exactly making that work easier. We're making it harder for ourselves. And so we can build this ability to include ourselves in the circle of humanity who are really deserving of compassion, our patients. We can be mindful, in other words, be aware of when we're the ones who are struggling. We can notice when we're going to self-criticism and challenge ourselves to flip that. What can I do to actually support myself in my time of difficulty? And we can recognize that difficulty is part of life for all of us, which reduces the sense of isolation that is another factor in burnout, that sense that everybody else is coping with this. What's wrong with me? When really, it's very likely that others are challenged in the exact same way that we are in any given situation. And I have some references here. I include references for the whole talk in the worksheet that you have. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But we're really learning that self-compassion has tremendous benefits. These are a few studies on the role of self-compassion in improving burnout and increasing engagement. It really can foster and deepen our own natural resilience, as well as many other positive effects. We're going to be talking about mindfulness later on. I'm just presenting it now as a bonus strategy because, again, people hear mindfulness and they think, oh, that's so woo-woo, monks meditating on the mountaintop, but it's really about working with your own mind. Learning which of your thoughts and mental stories and constructs are helpful to you and which aren't, and gaining agency over how to deal with the ones that aren't helping you. That's really what mindfulness is about. Another way to think about mindfulness is mind training. So we talk about that in the Mindful MD book that you'll each get a PDF copy of, and we'll be talking about that more, but it's another way to build your autonomy, control more of the stress, because that's a key factor in improving your biology. When we don't, we all know what this is like. We're over here stressed out about everything in the digital world, and there's our cat or dog just happy to be out in the sun. We covered a lot today, and forgive me if it's a lot to kind of throw at you, but I really wanted you to kind of think broadly about the challenges that are going on in healthcare, have an understanding of what burnout is and how high the levels are. Begin to unpack your own biology. Begin to understand what's going on inside of you, because that is the first step in shifting it to something that is more productive and resourceful for you. And then, of course, the 3 strategies. So focusing on your strengths as a way of reversing the deficit focus that we learn in our training, and it's reinforced by the negativity bias of the human mind. Don't let yourself run on empty. Optimize the function of your prefrontal cortex. You need it. You need it so that you can be at your best. So take care of yourself. Try to get
Well,
enough.
hi.
Make sure that you're meeting your nutritional and exercise needs. Building compassion for yourself, reversing that trend that many of us learn to be very critical of ourselves. And as we'll get into more in further sessions, practicing mindfulness. So we've got about 5 minutes. I'm going to get to Q&A in just a moment, but as you heard in the introduction, there are a number of resources that you will have access to through this empowering well-being program that Humana is investing in for all of you. The first is the PDF of our most recent book, Mindful MD, 6 Ways Mindfulness Restores Your Autonomy and Cures Healthcare Burnout. We're not here, and we're not talking about in the book sitting and meditating in time you don't have. It's how you use your mind, how you work with your mind. So I think you'll find it helpful. And then we have a number of self-paced online master courses that you will be getting access to. Burnout to Balance, Imposter No More, Med School 2.0 for the woman physician, and Physician to Physician Leader. So we really hope that you will avail yourself of these resources. We've spent a lot of time creating them, and we really hope they can be useful to you. And then we will have more of these workshop sessions. The next one is on emotional intelligence, mastering reactivity and conflict aversion. The next, mindfulness in action, how to reduce reactivity, build calm, and live with balance. And the third, grow well-being by building influence through communication.